Thanks to Miss Spudnut for helping with the funding for this video. If you'd like to have your own shoutout or get some special perks on the side, join the channel as a member today. These perks are also available through Patreon and Ko-fi, so if you'd like to stop there instead, feel free to do so. The links are in the description. Oh boy. Feeling worn out yet, guys? Well, tough. We still have to stomach a few more days until the cycle starts all over again. Wait, a few more days? I thought this was the New Year special. But that must mean... Oh, right! We're back in the festive spirit, fellas! Christmas is here once again! And in between all the shopping, the card sending, the gift wrapping, and the cooking, I'm sure you probably had a chance to see at least one of those beloved Christmas movies for the season. And we all know by now, there's a lot out there. We've gone through different pieces of this huge variety over the past few years, like the Christmas Carol movies, the Rhapsody Street Kids, and the Christmas Tree. Yeah, I still remember those. We've seen some of the Rankin Bass movies, and eventually extending to some other song-related Christmas movies. Yeah, there are many different types out there, but even if a lot of these may come off pure and jolly, that still doesn't save them from the fate that Hollywood places on the average movie. That fate being... sequels. When given the rights and the resources, pretty much anyone can take any movie and slap some kind of continuation onto it as they please, and Christmas movies are no exception. Now, regardless of whether or not the producers and directors mean well during the movie's process, the execution can still end up going in different directions for the end result. Maybe they could lead to something that has a surprising feel of heart and effort put into it that might make it come off as a genuinely dedicated follow-up to the original story, or they could just feebly juggle pieces of said original story and toss together an obnoxious cash grab from them that's gonna brutally damage those who love the original story until they presumably forget about it a couple months or so later. So I spent the past few months reading through the naughty and nice lists of the cinema variety and checked it twice. That's always important. Although I won't be going through every possible Christmas sequel in this run, but I still feel like I have a healthy amount of substance to work off here. And certainly a stretch in some circles, but I still feel we have a decent sleigh load of what can be considered some of the best, and the worst, of sequels that we got from Christmas movies. Just a heads up that I will bring up a few titles that I went through in the past, although I have no real intention of going too deep into those. That is, unless I have something new to add. That being said, I'm staying far away from those Alvin and the Chipmunk sequels. I don't care what I forgot to say about them last year, those are just too painful to touch again so soon. So with all that aside, let's see what we got in the first of our presents this year. Oh god, no! Well, it's only natural we start with the most iconic of these examples, the surprisingly big timeline of Home Alone movies. This journey goes all the way back to 1990, with the first movie put together through the workings of some pretty big names, like John Hughes, Chris Columbus, and John Williams. This was a tale about giving Kevin a chance of surviving in that big house on his own after a freak accident while preparing for a Christmas vacation in Paris, but he also ends up getting some pretty big positives in the process, like experiencing the soft side of his previously thought menacing neighbor, and getting the chance to put some planning into the safety of his house through some fairly clever and very effective traps against the wet bandits.
Oh my dude, you just got pranked!
And to top it off, Kevin learns about the value of his family, and they all learn they should love and appreciate each other and show it. The first movie alone came off delivering a lot of different feels: cute, adventurous, amusing, suspenseful, and most of all, sweet and touching. So yeah, it was a fairly enjoyable movie, and during that time it had a strong legacy standing solo. Then, everything changed when the Fox Nation attacked. After John Hughes was given a deal with the studio, Home Alone 2 was next to hit the scene in 1992. And if I'm gonna be honest, this was always my favorite movie in the series growing up. Just the idea that Kevin would be by himself in New York, and with the bandits after him at the same time? That sounded awesome! And for years I never really understood why everyone didn't like this one as much. But looking at it nowadays, yeah, I have a much better idea where they're coming from. A good portion of the story is mostly just cut and pasted from the first movie, with pretty much the same setup and threats and happy ending, but then there are also some of the newer details they added to this movie, and those can vary from interesting and nice touches for this big adventure, but then there are some that tumble all the way down to...
Oh shit, here we go again.
As for the whole movie itself, after my latest rewatch, part of me wants to say the characters have learned nothing from the first movie, but that's not entirely the case. Yeah, the more heartfelt lessons from the first movie may have been shrugged off at the start for this movie to make the plot actually happen, but then you have some of the other details that the characters did remember and were more prepared for this time. Now that was, and still is, one of my favorite factors from this movie. Yeah, it may still repeat a lot from the first movie, but this time they go an extra step or two forward with these different elements. And when done right, they can come off feeling really clever too. Like the fact that everyone made it to the airport this time, and the fact that the bandits are being an armed threat for once. These details also flow into some of the humor too, with the biggest examples being some of the traps where Kevin would reuse a few examples from the first movie, and again, still go one step ahead. There's also the luggage packing scene, which, while not as big an example, I still found to be a bit more charming here, as all these actors use more energy to rush around and get everything prepared, while in the first movie, they just sped up the footage while everyone was casually walking. Yeah, maybe not as riveting here. There's also the running joke of Marv becoming a sticky bandit, which had its moments, I'll admit. And last, it feels go a slight step further with Kevin giving the turtle dove as a Christmas gift to the pigeon lady. Sure, you could make the argument which might come off better, either this or Kevin convincing Marley to reunite with his family, but as for me, I feel a bit more teary-eyed in this example as I see a slightly bigger closure here. Just picture the thought of a modern Kevin still having that other dove with him after all these years. And you could think back to the pigeon lady and what they did for each other. It just feels so touching to see it that way. Still, looking at these two movies nowadays, I agree that the first movie is still slightly better overall, but I still can't deny there were some details in this movie that I say were handled better than they were the first time. Now some of you may feel this was a fair place to stop and let the title rest, but oh boy, we've still got quite a ways to go, fellas. Home Alone 3 would eventually rise to the screen, and this was where the cracks really started to show. The adventure begins again with a big house and the whole neighborhood being saved by the smarts of Alex.
Who?
Yeah, I guess it would make sense they went for a new character this time, given that Culkin was starting to get a little too old for the role by this point. Well, actually, from what I heard, they were planning to have Culkin come back as an older Kevin on the side, but due to his hiatus at the time, they gave him the boot instead. Which is a real shame, as that alone would have greatly helped this feel more like an actual sequel. Instead, we're left dealing with the new kid stopping international spies. Yeah, I'm not joking. They went from the sticky bandits to international spies. Man, if that's not the biggest narrative leap of the year, I don't know what is. We went from a kid fighting on his own and standing up for himself against common crooks, to a kid being left alone constantly with international spies roaming around. Granted, they are surprisingly clumsy spies, though international spies nonetheless. But I still wouldn't say it's terrible. There were a few details even this movie had that gave off some charm. While they unfortunately ditched the iconic Somewhere in My Memory tune, they added a new song which I found a little catchy, Cartoon Boyfriend's My Town. Yeah, it may sound like a generic montage song in some ways, but it does help lighten the mood while being reminded of some of the more boring scenes we got throughout. And like I said, Alex can be fairly smart for his age, and that's something I give him credit for. Once he first sees the spies and discovers the chip, his first course of action was to report it to the professionals, letting the police and the military know. Unlike Kevin, who'd be likely planning out the next few traps by now. So this movie wasn't as bad as I remember it being, but it certainly wasn't as good as the first two. Those had a better balance of comedy and heart, but here it felt more like they were just cramming more comedy and ditching the feels and thought that should have been the way to go. But on the bright side, John Hughes knew to draw the line here. He had the willpower to put the brakes on Home Alone after this, but did Fox?
Oh no!
And then the next thing we all knew, they made another one. And this time, nobody was prepared for it.
Oh no!
In 2002, they released Home Alone 4, or Home Alone Taking Back the House. A lot of fans agree this was the worst of the movies, and I'm right there with them. Some of you may remember I talked about this movie years ago in what was technically my first ever attempt at a review. And, well, not much has changed, although I feel I have a better shot at a more detailed dive into this. The third movie may have had some issues, but this was a far bigger drop in quality. Whether it was the casting or the writing, there was little to nothing to like about this. It goes to a point where you wonder just how much effort they actually tried to put into any of this. Well, okay, there was a bit of planning for the actual continuity, as they made an attempt to get Daniel Stern to come back and reprise his role of Marv for this movie. But as you could see, he took the safe bet and denied the offer. And we ended up with French Stewart, who, looking through some of his work, I guess he can be a decent actor in some places, and he may even have his rare moments here too, but are you trying to tell me they couldn't find anyone who looked remotely close to Stern for the role? I guess why bother? They couldn't care to find anyone who looked like Culkin for Kevin, or even the rest of the family or the Chicago setting for that matter. Even the traps have gotten lazier. Sure, there are still a few that may have had some actual thought put into them, and some of those may give off some satisfying reactions.
Yow! Pranked, baby!
But then there are those traps that cut more corners than ever by giving Kevin some smart devices and various technology. And this goes to the point where it starts to feel more like a sci-fi Home Alone or something. And overall, this movie just came out flat. You can tell the crew behind this was put through some desperate obligation during production. And even when they still try to scrape the remaining pieces they could for the story, like having Prescott represent the nice guy helping the kid by surprise trope in the first two movies, it still wasn't enough to balance out the insanely questionable decisions they made for the other details. And after the feedback this movie got, to the point of even causing the planned TV show to cancel production too, it seems like Fox knew it was a good idea to just let the series be and not try to fumble it up again. That is, until 10 years later. Apparently, they still couldn't let this title go, and they were tempted to make yet another one. Home Alone: The Holiday Heist, or Home Alone 5, was probably one of those sequels no one would have expected. Though granted, this movie wasn't as painful as the fourth one, it still wasn't that great either. You can tell the writers kinda learned from their mistakes by not lazily picking out a random kid to pass off as Kevin. This time, they picked out another random kid. But this time he's named Finn.
If you're an evil witch, I will punch you for fun.
Yeah, real funny, Zac. And they also put in a bit of effort to give him his own family and his own adventure with a different threat. While it may not have been as amusing or interesting as the originals, I still give them credit for trying to stray away from the rabbit hole that was the fourth one. Though honestly, my favorite thing about this movie was that they had Mr. Alex DeLarge himself, Malcolm McDowell, as one of the thieves this time. I can't really explain it, he just has the kind of dialogue and performance style I find to be a bit more fascinating and sometimes gets a laugh out of me. Like, I find myself taking more notice of a scene whenever he starts talking or reacting to different things. But maybe that's because his teammates don't really have as much to offer, or pretty much most of the characters for that matter. But okay, that's not entirely fair. I guess Finn's sister has her moments too sometimes, even if she's out of the way for a good portion of the story, but still in the house. Though that kinda takes away the alone portion from Home Alone, don't you think? Though of course, some of the traps can come off pretty neat too, with some amusing results.
Ha! Got him!
Especially since there's actual physical planning to a good portion of these and not just some crazy technology all throughout. Maybe some, but it's still not as noticeable as the fourth one, and I can give them credit for that. But overall, there's a chance this probably won't be something you'd want to spare a whole sitting for either. And before wrapping up this segment, I know there is a sixth movie too, but I couldn't seem to pull it up because I guess my devices hate Disney+, and besides, I feel we spent enough time on these movies already. Like many other people, I prefer just sticking with the first two movies, and the series unfortunately took a huge dive after that. But at least Macaulay still has some fondness for his time in the originals after all these years, and he's greatly shown that via TV interviews, commercials, and even YouTube web shows. I can't say when exactly, but after the huge spread of surprise sequels we've gotten from this series, I can already tell there's bound to be a seventh movie somewhere down the road too, but given all the constant losses of the later sequels, I doubt it would change anything by this point. Of course, a lot of us remember Jingle All the Way, as I talked about it last year too. It's that unusual Christmas gem with the one and only Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Nice night for a walk.
He runs amok to find a Turbo Man figure as a Christmas gift for his son, all while fighting off a team of Santas, police, reindeer, and even the Sinbad mailman. Yeah, it was mostly dumb, but it was presented and played out in a way that still helped make it fairly entertaining and kind of funny at times. And I'm sure some of us can find some relatable moments in the story too. Though this movie had a bit more going for it than meets the eye, but despite the fascination a lot of people may have had with it, I'm sure that feeling didn't pass through as well when a sequel was announced for this. To some, there might have been some off-putting replies at the time, worried about the changes there were going to be, but at the same time, maybe there were some who were pretty flexible about this. Like, I can understand some cast members not coming back for this, like Jake Lloyd, as he likely felt too old for this. Well, that as well as, you know, where his career went afterward. But hey, if we get to see Arnold make some kind of return here, that could still make it somewhat worth it, right? What? No! Of all people, he got replaced by Larry the Cable Guy? Not only that, there's no returning cast members here, no mentions to the story from the first movie, no Turbo Man, nothing!
No trip, nothing!
This time, instead of an over-the-top adventure for an action figure, Larry's going through his own search to find his Harrison bear. So it might seem like they're trying to repeat the same elements from the first movie, but don't let it fool you. Just about everything comes off lazier and flimsier than you'd expect. from the characters, to the jokes, to the feels, to the energy, and the action scenes. Oh my god, there's hardly anything that came off memorable or worth to watch here. I might come off a bit harsh for saying this, but a lot of what we got here felt like it was on a similar level to Home Alone 4. Yeah, I found it that flat. And what's more surprising, that this was made with help from WWE Studios. Wow, I never thought I'd see the wrestling people interested in a Christmas movie. And yet that's still debatable. As with this kind of studio at play, they could have had someone like this, but instead they went with someone like that. But even with the changes in structure they gave the story, I doubt it would have made that much of a difference to save any of this. Now, the Santa Claus I feel is a lot less likely to be seen going through the sequel treatment at the time, but don't worry, that too eventually met that very fate. Albeit it happened about 8 years after the first movie. But despite everything it went through, I can still understand the charm a lot of people may have seen from the first movie. Scott starts changing from the extremely generic busy father type to something far bigger than he would have expected. The first movie was naturally the most simple of the bunch, as it centers around Scott slowly turning into the new Santa as he tries on the old Santa suit after accidentally killing him. And Scott starts coming to terms with his new life over time, and ends up taking on his new life as Santa. While at the same time, he also goes through the emotional closing of having to leave behind his former life and time with his family for this reason. This was the only movie in the trilogy that didn't really have a villain, unless you count the police, but that's basically it. The story still delivered fairly well without a direct antagonist. They used their time as wisely as they could to flesh out the atmosphere and set up the rules, and they did a decent job showing the whole Santa Claus itself and the rules and magic that come with it. They gave a decent showing of this version of the North Pole and the different types of elves that live there, and while it may not be the most entertaining or impressive movie out there, it was still pretty solid on its own. It had its moments and a very unique and sometimes creative story, and while it's one of the very few Tim Allen films I've seen, outside of Toy Story, he still gave a stable performance for this kind of position. Then the Santa Claus 2 came out in 2002, and so many twos. And, well, as expected, you can see quite a dip in the story coming from different directions. While the North Pole setting still gives off a fun and cute looking atmosphere, and while it's still interesting seeing the different positions all these elves have, they're visually carried through with the CG effects, which maybe could have been better. And I'm not just talking about the elves, I'm talking about like the reindeer and some of the other details. And the downside of the visuals also brings us to the villain in this movie. This creepy Santa clone. Yeah, wow, this guy's creepier looking than I remembered. And it certainly doesn't help that he's probably the loopier of the villains we've gotten from these movies. Like, even when I first saw this, I felt they could have done more with the kind of plan he had. Though I do get what they were trying to go for with his character and his thought process, he's kind of like a robot. They program him to act and think a certain way, and it ends up going too far. Okay, that makes sense. But I feel maybe this guy could have come off as a more decent villain if they got to show the effects of his changes and what it might do to some of the kids around the world. Maybe a noticeable amount might get really upset at the thought of having all that coal and they start going crazy and do things that actually put them on the naughty list after all, and that could have been his plan from the start? Well, at least that would have been a far better reason for the extreme views he's shoving in the elves' faces. Then maybe Scott and the elves could have stepped in to fix everything and stop the evil Santa as usual. I don't know. That probably could have been of better use than some of the other story pieces we got here that ended up getting rushed. And speaking of, there's this whole commotion about Scott having to find a new Mrs. Claus. And yet, no one really explains what happened to the old one. Did she just abruptly disappear with the old Santa? And sure, you could say I was probably thinking too much about this at the time, but even as a kid I could tell based on the circumstances that it was obviously going to be Carol being the new Mrs. Claus. And I can't believe Scott believing she'd be the one for him, and yet he still thought it was a good idea to blow so much of his magic on her? I mean, yeah, sure, it worked in the end, but how was he gonna know it would? They never really explained this kind of stuff, and the next thing you know, boom, he's helpless. Though it was amusing to see him getting help from the Tooth Fairy, I'll admit that was a pretty nice bit. But overall, I guess this one takes a bit more benefit of the doubt than the first one. But even when I saw this as a kid, I would usually prefer skipping out on this one. The Santa Claus 3, on the other hand, was where things started to get more wild. For better and for worse. I will say for a start, the villain this time was certainly more of a step up. They knew how to make Jack Frost a more interesting type than the last villain. Right off the bat, Martin Short gave a pretty entertaining performance for the most part. He provides that kind of energy and delivery where you can have a healthy balance of amusing moments, and also lets him come off pretty threatening at times. His purpose and motive also helps bring a bit more impact on the Council of Legendary Figures we learned about in the last movie, as he finds himself inferior in comparison to the others, and decides to steal the Santa position to get a feel of that attention himself. And what he does to the North Pole afterward leads to a balance of negative effect on the elves in relation to commercial corruption on the visitors. You know, like the real Disney company. But aside from him, there wasn't really much else to enjoy here. Carol becomes surprisingly unlikable at this as she gets mad at Scott for being busy at his work. I mean, if this is a callback to Scott from the first movie, I can see where they're coming from, as that also plays a part in the story too. And sure, it would make sense that the constant messes in front of her parents would lead to a slight upset feeling, but the fact that she has a problem with him being this busy around Christmas? Hasn't she been around him long enough to know this could happen? And this also raises the question, if she cares for her family so much to let confrontation like this happen, then why leave them to this extreme of a level? Was it all just for the last movie to have its happy ending? I said before that movie was rushed, and this movie just shows the results of that. But despite the problems it may have, I can still see some enjoyment of this, mostly thanks to Jack, as well as maybe a few moments on the side, but then there are those parts that are just harder to sit through than I remembered. The series may have had a charming start, but then you could tell they didn't really know where to go from this afterward when they tried. At this point, there's not really much they could do to salvage from this concept, except for maybe that miniseries The Santa Claus is, but even that didn't seem to last long either. A Christmas Story is definitely one of those titles that compares to Home Alone. Shown from a child's perspective during Christmas time with some zany moments strung in between, it finds ways to be just as charming as those kinds of movies. Here we see a slice of life about Ralphie, who develops a huge fascination for the Red Ryder BB gun, and he wants everyone to know it's the thing he wants for Christmas and hopes he'll get it that year. But it doesn't just give us that. This also goes into the daily life of Ralphie, showing the interactions and incidents he faces at school, in the neighborhood, with his family, and all with that grown-up Ralphie to narrate everything. There were a handful of moments that may have been amusing enough on their own, but I feel the older Ralphie narrations are what really sell a lot of these moments. It really gives off the impression of a grandpa telling his grandkids the memories he had back in those days, all set with comedic reactions thinking back to everything, even when the running joke with the BB gun pays off. I'm surprised it took me years to finally sit down to it, and when I finally did, man, it was surprisingly enjoyable. And apparently many others felt that way too. I mean, just look at everything that came out of it. From the stage play and the commercials that reference it and all that merchandise. Oh god! Though yeah, it was a cute and charming movie at the time, and despite a few details, it still holds up fairly well. But I really don't think the original producers wanted this much attention, and especially didn't want the 2012 sequel either. Apparently, this was bad on a level where a lot of people seem to prefer not remembering this one and calling the more recent sequel as the only second movie. But I'll go into that one in a moment. This time, given that Ralphie's older, he's moved away from the BB gun phase and he wants a car now. And from there, a majority of the plot revolves around him saving money to pay for the damage he gave said car, and then there's the back and forth between high school life and various jobs, which the writers thought they could use to bring back some of that charm by copying some jokes from the first movie, but what we got instead was just a load of unpleasant delivery, as well as some newer jokes which might sound promising given that the writers wanted to think more outside the box, and yet those were equally likely to not really get the chuckles. And then there's the casting. Well, the good news is that they found a kid to look decently close to an older Ralphie for this movie, and they also got a narrator to back him up too. Though I'd have to say sometimes he got backed up way too much by the narrator, and I can't believe I'm about to say this, but this gets a little frustrating at times, and you start to forget that Ralphie even has things to say in the first place. And they also got... Oh, come on, Stern, really? You dodged Home Alone 4 only to end up in this movie? I could say more, but none of these other members really have that much to offer, and they don't seem to care either. Sometimes they try to include more aspects from the first movie, but they either come off way more excessive than they should, or just feel like the writers didn't understand what gave them their charm in the first place. They're just thrown together in the story to the point where it starts feeling... just unbearable at times, and it never seems to pull itself back together. You'd think the WB studio would have given up by this point, but Oh no, just a few years ago they decided again to take a crack at this property, albeit with help from HBO Max this time, so I guess we should wrap up this special with the most recent of these movies that we got from the bunch. This brings us to A Christmas Story Christmas, released in 2022, almost 40 years after the first movie. At first glance, could you really think there'd be any actual dedication with this big a time gap? Well, as much as it personally shocked me to see, there was an attempt this time. They put in the effort to bring as many of the original cast members as they could back together, and they even acknowledged their older ages with an in-context time gap too, which does seem like a nice idea overall, though that does tie into a common issue that may come off jarring throughout. That issue being the sense of nostalgia and how much it clashes with the story. In different scenes, they throw in quotes and moments from the original movie, and while it may be a little tiring as it goes on, you could say it was mostly meant to be clever to help re-deliver some of those specific laughs from those very kids now as adults. In this kind of circumstance, it's a pretty solid argument, but this also blunts one of the bigger feels this movie sets up. One of the main story arcs was about everyone coming back to share Christmas together in memory of Ralphie's dad, the old man. And you'd think with such a strong potential detail, they could have used a bit more of that nostalgia to show how impactful and helpful he was in the first movie. And yet they just use it for all these different quotes and scenes with drinking. I mean, couldn't they use some of this to show all the different things he did for the family, either comedic or feels-wise? But hey, on the bright side, they still had other ways to deliver those kinds of emotions. Just seeing everyone reunite after so long can give off some nice feelings in its own way. Especially for those of you who've spent a long time away from a childhood friend of yours or family member. Anyone can go through a scenario like that, and I'm sure it can feel really sweet to see that very kind of scenario with these familiar characters. And a lot of them with the same actors too. In a way, they're literally reliving those feels. So if that's something you'd think sounds promising, then this might actually be one you'd want to give a try this Christmas if possible. This is the kind of movie I surprisingly found fairly decent. It's like a fair balance in the middle, not quite as good as the original, and yet a lot better than their first attempt at the sequel. Yeah, there are a handful of different extensions to all these movies, but for those who still may not be a fan, always remember we have these presents to look back on. The original films where these all started, and gave off some nice holiday cheer for the festive season. Like I said, there are still a few titles out there I left out, but if I am to try this again next year, then maybe I'll go back to cover those too. Like some others, I felt there were some examples in these sequels that came off decent and somewhat enjoyable at times, as well as a fair share of the heavy losses too. But who knows? Maybe as time goes on, we'll end up living in an era of the future where these studios will discover a way to make great, or at least reassuring Christmas sequels. Yeah, it seems very unlikely now, but it would be nice to see their constant attempts feel more worth it. And it would be nice to find a way to make that feeling a tad more common should they keep going this route. But like I always say at the end of these videos, we'll soon see, won't we? Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, everyone! Alright, we'll do it once more, for old time's sake. Shut that door!